So, welcome once again to BNE's weekly video blog with me, Ben Aris, the editor-in-chief of BNE, and Liam Halligan, our editor-at-large in London.
Ben.
Good to see you, Liam. So, the main events of this week, and we're going into the slowdown in the summer, have been the end or the beginning of the end of the protests in Armenia called Electric Yerevan. And of course, the BRIC summit in Ufa, where the BRIC leaders came together to do various deals and to continue cementing their relationships.
Ben, there's been a lot of coverage about Electric Yerevan in BNE. I haven't seen much coverage elsewhere in the mainstream media. Why do we think it's so important, and what are its implications?
I think it's key. It's a key issue, at least. Although, of course, Armenia sort of lies off the agenda for most of the international press. But this whole issue of how much does power cost, it lies at the roots of a lot of what's going on in terms of governments needing to reform, catch up. We're actually planning to do a big cover story on it to drill down into this. But the main takeaway is that, the cost of power is indicative of how far you've gone in reforms, and it's one of the biggest issues every government's got to deal with is how do you pay for the electricity to run your economy. And the hike in the power tariffs here have obviously been extremely painful for the Armenians, which is to say the government hasn't grown the economy much so that they can't afford this power. But our conclusion was that the whole power issue, power tariffs issue, lies at the heart also of the Ukrainian troubles, because they didn't make any reforms over 20 years, and now the IMF has asked them to double or treble. And they haven't, because they didn't do that, they couldn't afford to pay for the gas that they were importing from Russia, whereas had they made the increases, they would be able to.
So how do you think Armenia is going to impact the debate over power tariffs in Ukraine, which, of course, is a much more high-profile moment?
Well, the power increases in Ukraine were forced on them by the IMF. They said, look, you cannot afford to pay this. And the government incredibly reluctant to do it because utility bills is the one bill that you can't escape. So no matter how poor you are, you can sort of get by. You can ignore your taxes. You can cheat on your VAT, but the utility, they just cut you off if you don't pay. So it's the one place the government, and that's why the governments are so reluctant to raise the tariffs, because it's political suicide. And in Ukraine's case, they're basically bankrupt. And the IMF said, okay, this can't go on. You have to put it on a rational basis. You have to take the pain. And again, we have these demonstrations in front of the Rada that have been ongoing. People do feel the pain. They're very unhappy about it. The government there is incredibly unpopular. And eventually this is going to spark civil unrest in Ukraine and other countries too that face the same issue, like Moldova, like Albania, who are all in the same position. In fact, I think fully half of the countries in the region need to make dramatic increases in tariffs of one sort or another, which will cause less or more pain depending on how well off those countries are. You've been following the BRIC summit in Ufa this week very closely. I mean, what's your main takeaway? I thought it was significant, although not much happened news-wise. I thought the actual meeting itself was significant. The countries coming together, showing more solidarity as part of this. What was?
I thought the meeting was significant as well. It's it's a real kind of treat for people who follow diplomatic shadow boxing. Some really interesting developments. I thought yes. you had India and Pakistan saying that they would join the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This was actually a joint meeting of
SCO and the BRIC countries, yeah.
BRICS, the informal grouping: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and the SCO, which of course is a more formal institution that joins together Russia, China, and the Central Asian countries so far. But you now have both India and Pakistan together saying that they're going to join the SCO.
Liam, isn't that amazing? Are they joint members of any other body?
There aren't many organisations in the world that India and Pakistan are members of. Obviously, they're big I think they're obviously both members of the UN in a loose sense. Well, obviously India's on the UN Security Council. Pakistan often seen as a rogue state, rightly or wrongly, depending on your perspective. A joint photo op just shows the power, the potential power of the SCO as part of the broader BRICS movement to engender cooperation. Rather more crunchy headlines. We had the announcement of $100 billion reserve pool that the BRICS are going to put together in order to insulate each other from volatility. Volatility being a code word for possible systemic market lurches emanating from the West and in particular the Eurozone. We had also a commitment that the NDB, the New Development Bank, the so-called BRICS Bank, will make its first infrastructure loan, Ben, by April 2016. Yep. These milestones may or may not be met, but the fact that they're being publicly aired is certainly interesting, because to not now meet them would lead to a loss of face. We also had a general sense coming out of Bashkiria.
I wanted to pick up on that thing. One of Putin's comments was that we the emerging markets are worried about this volatility, global volatility, and he specifically highlighted, look, these developed world countries have massive amounts of debt, and that makes the whole financial system volatile. And it sounds like it's just a talking point, a bit of rhetoric, but I actually think that this is one of the reasons why we see this gelling at the BRICS summit, this coming together. The emerging markets are like clubbing together because they can do business. There was a promise from the West of investment, and very little's arrived in many countries. But this issue of we're now splitting the world not into emerging markets and developed worlds, but into indebted countries and debt-free countries. And the emerging world is largely debt-free. The developed world is heavily in debt up to 100% of GDP, which means there are going to be future crises, because these countries can't afford this debt. And the emerging markets are looking at them. I think they are genuinely concerned, which is another reason why they're clubbing together, to circling the wagons to deal with this problem.
BRICS reserve pool, this $100 billion reserve pool, Ben, is the physical embodiment of this kind of cooperation and trying to convey the sense that the emerging markets are an island of stability with 3/4 of the world's currency reserves, and the more indebted developed countries are the ones where the systemic issues are going to emanate from. Also, you had Putin pressing some buttons, talking about what's going on in Greece. It's not all Greece's fault. And you had Putin also putting pressure on the negotiations about Iranian sanctions, calling for an end to sanctions on Tehran.
I mean, but this highlights exactly the issue that they're complaining about, isn't it? I mean, Greece is on the cusp of default. Ukraine also on the cusp of default, and yet the developed world is not prepared to bail it out. I mean, isn't this all symptomatic of exactly the problems that you were just talking about? What do you think is going to happen with Greece?
Quite astonishing. It's Sunday morning now. We've just had near all-night negotiations. We've got another set of negotiations this morning about Greece, and then an EU leaders meeting this evening. Germany reportedly preparing for Greece to take some kind of sabbatical from the euro. Certainly, all bets are off. And the leaders of the new emerging markets, they want to show, look, this is not our problem.
Yeah. And we don't want to play that game too. Reserve funds, low debt, growth, that's the way forward. And, well, we'll see. I mean, Ukraine's also got a deadline coming up this week where it may default, and looks very close to it. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So once again, thanks to Liam for joining me, and we'll check in again in a week. All the best.